If you're not familiar with how this virtual format works, let me explain that if you want to ask a question of our guests, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing a copy of Dan's book, What Unites Us. You know, for those of us of a certain generation who grew up watching Dan report the news on CBS for 44 years, it's quite nostalgic to recall his broad appeal, the authority with which he delivered his reports, and the indelible mark he left on our consciousness. But what's also remarkable is the ability he's shown in more recent years to connect with and communicate to younger generations, particularly through social media. His identity had been so tied up with CBS over so many years that when he left the network 14 years ago, amid some controversy, he wasn't sure what he'd do next. But Dan has always had a passion for reporting, and he's kept at it, continuing to find avenues for offering news updates and reflections on current events, whether through a cable channel, independent production company, online newscast, or Facebook postings. Tomorrow, believe it or not, Dan turns 89. Yes, he was a Halloween baby, and anyone who wants to can send him a birthday greeting in the chat column. Dan's book, What Unites Us, which first appeared 3 years ago and is now in paperback, consists of a collection of his essays. The chapters sound pretty basic, with such headings as the press, empathy, science, the environment, and public education. But Dan personalizes many of these topics by wrapping in anecdotes from his storied life while reflecting on the qualities and trends that have made our country what it is today, and offering thoughts on what should be done to deal with current challenges. Dan, of course, is outspokenly patriotic, but he's also made no secret of his deep sense of alarm about the shattering of important norms of American life, about entrenched partisanship, growing inequality, and persistent injustices. And he brings a seasoned perspective. Still, he remains essentially optimistic, believing in the fundamental resilience, integrity, and honesty of Americans. And he brings a seasoned perspective and sense of balance and reason to a public discussion that nowadays is all too often dominated by politically motivated distortions and just plain untruths. Dan will be in conversation this evening with Jennifer Steinhauer, who in her more than 25 years with the New York Times has worked on the Metro business and national desks, and for the past decade has lived here in Washington covering Congress. She's the author of a novel, 2 cookbooks, and most recently, The Firsts, which tells the story of the women elected to Congress in 2018, when more women than ever made it into our national legislature. So Dan and Jennifer, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Nice introduction. You ready for some tough questions, Dan?
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
So situate us a little bit in your lifestyle right now in this strange era. Where are you right now? Are you like the rest of us? When was the last time you wore a tie? You know, do you wear shoes? What's it like for you right now?
Well, I'm coming to you live and direct from beautiful downtown Austin, Texas. As you may know, Jean, my wife of 62 years, we're both native Texans, 5th and 6th generation Texans, and we've always had a place in Texas. Although fair to say that for roughly the last half of my life, that I lived happily and worked in New York. And we still are based in New York because the nature of my work is New York is the best place for it. However, when the pandemic hit, I was in New York and Jean was visiting in Texas. I have a daughter and a grandson who live here. So we kind of got trapped apart, if you will, as the pandemic settled in. And I was in New York without Jean at our home in New York. She was at our place in Texas, March, April, May, part of early June. Finally, in early June, I came to Texas to rejoin her. And she and I have been pretty much hunkered down here since that time, doing our best to not get the virus, not give the virus, and not put any extra burden on people who are fighting the good fight. So that's where we are. Professionally, most of my work now consists of an interview program, which I do for Access TV. It's a cable and satellite television channel. That I have a news site called newsandguts.com, which we use for what reporting we're able to do. And then also on social media, I have Facebook and Twitter, and spend a good deal of time on social media. I have some other things going, there's no sense listing them. I feel really blessed to be able to have work at this age and stage of my life, that I'll be 89 years old tomorrow. And as I'm fond of saying, because it's true, I've reached that stage in life where I don't even buy green bananas anymore. I'm just thankful for each and every day.
Well, that's great. We're going to talk about Texas. We're going to talk about social media, but I want to kind of get to the major theme of your book here, What Unites Us. That's the title. And often these days, when people talk about uniting and we should unify, what people often really mean is they want people who have opposing views to be quiet, or to assimilate, or just to agree with them, and that's how they get united. So the theory of the case, if you will, with your book is that there are already existing practices and structures that are there that can be threaded together to unite us to common purpose. So could you kind of, if you had to single one or two of them out, because you touch on a lot of them in the book, that you think are either the most important or perhaps in this environment, at least the most achievable, what would you cite?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you framed the book that way, because that's exactly what I set out to do with Elliot Kirshner, who's my co-author of the book, was set out to identify those things on which that we can all agree, or if it isn't unanimous, that a great majority of us can all agree, these are things we agree on. Because as you pointed out, it's increasingly difficult to sort of pause, take a breath and say, first of all, do we agree on anything? And if we agree on something, then what is it? Now, among the things that I think that there's near universal agreement, what do we agree on universally or nearly universally? Just to state some, what I think are obvious things, but often get forgotten. I think there's a near universal agreement on the right to vote, one person, one vote. And yes, there are all kinds of political operatives who seek to suppress the vote and influence the vote. We agree, one person, one vote. Freedom of speech, freedom to dissent, free press. I do think there's general agreement on these things as a broad generality. You can say, well, let's take the free press. Not everybody likes the press. Some people think the press we don't live up to our responsibilities. But, and this is the point, do we believe that a free press is in the end absolutely vital to a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy such as ours? I would argue that almost universally people agree with that. I also think there's a general agreement on that we are a people, we're a society, we're a country, we place a heavy premium and value on science and knowledge. We have since the very beginnings of the republic. We have consistently all the way through. Now, we can have different opinions about some scientific theory, some scientific finding, but this is a part of what has held us together, particularly the putting a premium on knowledge, that we're dedicated to having as good a schools as we possibly can. Again, people can have differences of opinion how that's to be achieved, but I think it's one of the things. On some others, I've mentioned empathy, being empathetic. We are an empathetic people. And it's easy to forget that we need to practice it every day in our own personal lives, as well as see it as a national value. But I do think that compassion is another. I think we see ourselves as a compassionate people, and most people want to be compassionate. So that's the spirit of the book. And I do emphasize, Jennifer, that, I don't have all the answers. And one can argue I don't have any of them, or not very many of them. But what we hope to accomplish with the book was help start a conversation about this very subject of, well, what does unite us? Not that we have the answers, but we wanted to start a good conversation about it.
And yet we've seen the erosion of such things as certain, widely held beliefs in certain parts of science and so forth. I'm glad you mentioned empathy. I did want to talk to you about that. Do you feel there's been an erosion of empathy in contemporary times? How do you account for that? How do we regain that?
Frankly, the answer is yes. I do think there's been some erosion. First of all, I think there's been an erosion in the number of people who understand what empathy is. Empathy is different from pity. And one of my own favorite sections of the book, naturally, when you write a book, you have a lot of favorite sections of the book, but one of my favorite sections of the book is the chapter on empathy, and giving my own explanation based on my own experiences of the difference between pity and empathy. But in answer to your question, I do think there's been, beginning with not that it isn't taught as often now, by example or otherwise, of the difference between empathy and pity. And that has led to an erosion of people even vaguely understanding what empathy is. But I would argue, and I recognize there's some people who may want to argue the other way, that when people stop and think about it, if you stop and take a breath and think about it, do most Americans want to be empathetic? I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes.
Now, I think that you're talking about that chapter, and I think if I believe the one you're talking about, you centered that in your childhood in the Heights neighborhood of Houston, and caring for neighbors and so forth who may have had even less than you did, and you were not growing up rich by any stretch of imagination. Let's pivot for a second to the Lone Star State, because for a lot of people in our audience, they don't know a lot about Texas. And I think it would be great if you could decode it a little bit, because we're talking about, this happened last time, and now even more seriously, talking about Texas as a possible swing state this year, right? Certainly moving politically a lot in the time of your childhood. Could you give us just a real quick sort of decoding of Texas and what's going on there, and why we're suddenly seeing a place that we've associated with certain things politically for so long, kind of evolving, if you will?
Well, Texas, of course, has changed dramatically since my childhood there. And keep in mind, I was born in Texas, as was my father, as was his father, and as was his father. And of course, everything has changed over the course of our lifetime. And here in 2020, the end of the second decade of the 21st century, what hasn't changed? But Texas has changed dramatically. And its sort of national and international image is not caught up yet with the full extent of the changes. The biggest change in Texas, and that's saying a mouthful because there have been so many changes, is the demographic change in Texas. That Texas now, it's a rich mix of people of different races, ethnic background, religion, a much richer mix than it was for most of my lifetime in the early years. And Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the country, is, in the way I view Houston now, if you want to know what the rest of the United States, much of the rest of the United States is going to look like as we proceed in the 21st century, take a look at Houston, because it's demographically as mixed as any place in the country that I know of, with the possible exception of maybe New York or Los Angeles. But the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 changed immigration policies in the country as a whole. And the change demographically for the whole of our United States of America has changed dramatically. I don't know of any place where it's changed to a greater extent than it has in Texas. And what that means, as in a practical matter, is that what some people call the Latinx, the population of Hispanic background, has grown tremendously. The African American population has grown tremendously, but also people of Asian heritage are in the mix. So that's, I think, the most important thing to know about the Texas today, as opposed to the Texas in which I grew up. I would say two other things very quickly. That, for most of my for all of the early years of my life, Texans felt a very closeness to the land, that you couldn't be a Texan, you couldn't live in Texas very long without feeling at one with the land, because it was basically a rural state. It is now much more urban than it is rural. And I still think a lot of people haven't quite caught up with that reality of the state. In political terms, it has been ruby red for statewide election of officials, all Republican, gone Republican in recent elections. All this talk about Joe Biden and the Democrats might carry at this time, most of that is based on the tremendous, and I use the word measuredly, the tremendous turnout of the vote before Election Day. Because the rules of when people can vote and how people can vote ahead of Election Day have changed, that there's been a tidal wave, a real tsunami of turnout. And Democrats like to believe that that will benefit them. It may, but count me as I'm not totally convinced of that.
Right.
And that if you had to bet it at this moment, I think most political professionals would still bet that Trump carries the state. But what's excited Democrats is, based on the polls and some other factors, they begin to think that maybe lightning's going to strike, maybe the miracle will happen. And should Texas fall in line for the Democratic presidential ticket, at least, never mind down ballot, it would change the whole dynamic of this election on Tuesday. Because if Donald Trump, if he doesn't carry Texas, that would mean he wouldn't carry Texas, California, New York, and Illinois. And it's pretty hard to make any mathematical equation in which he wins the race if he doesn't carry Texas. But I do want to emphasize that I think if you have to bet the money right now, you still bet Trump carries it.
Right, right. Very interesting. Well, I want to talk about the media a little bit some more and just remind people, I see a lot of birthday wishes in the chat, which is great. If you want to ask a question, we'll turn to audience questions in a little while. You should do it in the Q&A, and people can kind of choose which questions they most want to hear. So go ahead and pop those in there while we're visiting. What was your view, Dan? This has been talked about a lot, but over the last 4 years, but I'd like to hear yours on the role of the media and the rise and the ultimate election of Donald Trump. And in terms of that, do you think that if there were lessons to be learned, what were those? And do you think they've been applied at all in the 2020 election?
Well, let's take those 1, 2, 3. First, in 2016, I do think the way the media, I always prefer the word press, but that's yesterday's man. But the way the media handled Donald Trump in 2016 contributed greatly to not only his getting the nomination, but to his winning the presidency. For a lot of reasons, beginning with, he got a tremendous amount of free television time. If you remember, the networks, and there were some exceptions to this, but in general, the networks competed with one another to see who could carry the most Donald Trump rallies live. He doesn't have to pay a penny for any of them. And there were hours after hours after hours of attention paid to Trump, particularly with his rallies, which I don't think there's any question helped him tremendously. And it was the sort of the fascination of the press, and there are no excuses. And by the way, I include myself to a certain degree in this criticism, because he was a different candidate, a candidate different from anything we'd seen, certainly in the modern presidential era. I would argue through the whole history of the country, but certainly in the modern presidential campaign era, he was different. He put on a show, and it was entertaining. And so under the guise of, quote, news, the media consistently put on the entertainment that was Donald Trump. So I do think that, I think also there was a great reluctance when Donald Trump would tell something that was not true, never mind an outright lie. I hate to use the word lie, but it's something we've learned. You have to use it in the reference we have here. There was a great reluctance in the 2016 campaign to call his hand, to say, no, Mr. Candidate, that's not a fact, that's an untruth, or even more to the point, that's an outright lie, which is to say an untruth that you know to be an untruth. So those are among the mistakes made in 2016. I do think a better job has been done in this campaign. One could argue, I'm not sure I'd make the argument that a considerably better job is done this time. First of all, there is some reluctance, and particularly in the latter stages of the presidential campaign itself this year, there's been considerable reluctance to carry so many rallies live. Some still are, but a lot of them are not covered. Secondly, the press far and away does a much better job of fact checking on what the president says. When it's an untruth, making sure that it's called an untruth, follow up questions when he doesn't answer that. There's been a much better job of that done this time than was last time.
So let's talk about social media. You alluded to that earlier. Obviously, the bulk of your career preceded the social media movement, if you will. And yet you're very active on Facebook, Twitter. You're like, you're the AOC of Facebook, and you're pretty out there on Twitter too. How do you think social media would have changed your career and the things that you did decades ago if we had had that? And how are you observing the way journalists, it changes the way they work now? And what do you think about that?
Well, we said earlier in talking about how things changed in Texas that, everything has changed over the last 50 years. And I've been a working journalist for more than 70 years. So, everything has changed. As to your question, it's very hard to compare the era in which I came up first in print, where I worked when I began, then in radio, then in television. It's very hard to compare the eras. But among the differences now in the social media era and the internet era is that for most of my early and what I'll call mid-career, journalists, generally speaking, had a deadline. Even those in daily journalism had a deadline once or twice a day. If you work for a newspaper, the New York Times, as you had a deadline once a day, maybe around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And you could spend the rest of the day making telephone calls, going to see people, actually wearing out shoe leather. And you could do the same thing at night. With the advent first of cable television and satellite television, what became a deadline, once or twice a day for most reporters, began to develop into deadlines more often. But now the big difference today is there's a deadline every nanosecond, that reporters are under tremendous pressure to meet competition. A rocket from the home office, can you meet or beat our competition on this story? To do Facebook, to do Twitter, in addition to filing stories much more regularly. So there's less time to do basic reporting, far less time for most reporters today than there was for most of the time that in my career. The other was that, that there are many more questions today along the lines of, well, who is and who isn't actually a journalist? Mm-hmm. Those questions got asked far less often for most of the time I was coming up. But now it's a fair question. If a person has no training, no background in journalism, but seeks to call themselves a journalist and they file on social media, are they a journalist or are they not? I mean, those kind of questions it did not exist for most of my career.
Well, one last question on the media, because, I think a lot of us have this perception, or other people who are not in our profession have the perception that this hostility towards journalists that we see at the Trump rallies and so forth, fake news, that's kind of a new thing. And yet, I went back and read the story about the time that you were faced violence in 1986. The What's the Frequency Kenneth incident, 1986. I was a senior in high school. I mean, this is what happened. And you said at that time, at least when the assailant was arrested, you thought that reflected a distrust and an anger toward the media then. Do you think this has always been simmering, or what's different now?
Well, the biggest difference now is the President of the United States has unrelentingly been attacking the press. Mm-hmm. Not just individual members of the press, not just individual press institutions, but everybody and anybody in the press. And he's done so unrelentingly and, in my opinion, without conscience. And that has exacerbated the feeling, and this has been his desire, to undercut people's belief in the press and trust in the press and the integrity of the press. Your point is well taken, that going back as certainly as far as the 1950s and 60s and growing some during the Nixon administration in the 70s and on in through the Reagan administration of the 80s, there were deliberate attempts by the president and those around him to undercut the belief in the press's integrity. But we've never seen anything like these direct, unrelenting attacks on the part of the president. And I think that's exacerbated about it. I would say at that time of the attack, that was in the mid-1980s, where you're referring to, it became a much publicized case in which it turned out, in fact, the person who attacked me on the street visited the NBC Today show and murdered a person there. This person was caught and is still in prison because of it. There was an argument, his defense made an argument that he had psychological problems. But your point is well taken. What's different today is it really has exploded, fueled by the leadership of this particular president. I do think the damage is deep. I think it will take time to repair it. And an answer to the next question is, well, what should we journalists do? I think we need to be concerned about it, but not obsess on it. That my advice to myself is just do the damn job. Do the best reporting you can do. Try to explain to people what you're trying to do, which is trying to get to the truth, or as close to the truth as we possibly can, and to tell it. And to do that, we gather facts, we analyze the facts, connect the dots, and stand up and tell the truth as we see it.
And wear a mask, obviously, while we're doing it. Let's talk about presidents. You've interviewed every president since Eisenhower. What sticks out to you when you reflect upon that career of that as the most difficult interview or the most kind of tense moment among some of those interviews? I know there's a lot, and that's a big question, but I'm sure one sticks out at least.
Well, first of all, I want to say it may sound corny or sophomoric to some people, but I've never interviewed a president that I didn't feel honored to do so and privileged to do so. President Eisenhower was probably the easiest because I was a younger reporter, and it didn't last very long. He was the first president that I interviewed. It didn't last very long. So it wasn't difficult, but it was memorable. And difficult, I'm pausing because I could pick any one of two or three as a certain moment being difficult. But I would say that Richard Nixon was probably the most difficult. That there was always and it wasn't something unique to me. I think most journalists, if not every journalist that had spent any time with him, he was uncomfortable within himself. And that led to a certain feeling within yourself. This is not a comfortable situation. Even if it was not something confrontational, such as the now famous or infamous time when things were closing in on him at the time of the crimes that we call for shorthand Watergate. It was becoming increasingly apparent that the President of the United States had led a widespread criminal conspiracy out of the Oval Office itself. And as that was becoming apparent, he was feeling increasingly cornered. And in a news conference in Houston, when I rose to ask a question, anticipating that it might be a tough question, he tried to throw me off balance, and I responded to that. That was a particular situation, but I think it encapsulated in a few seconds some of the awkwardness and the uncomfortableness of trying to interview Richard Nixon. I did a 1-hour primetime interview with him in 1972, in which, just to give you an anecdote, but I think it's on point, that when I came to check out the room in the White House where the interview would take place, there was a fireplace glowing. The interview would have the fireplace in the middle with the president on one side and I on the other side. But the room was at about 35 degrees. And there was a Secret Service man there whom I had known, and I said to him, gee, I love the fireplace, but what's with near freezing temperature? And he very calmly explained, he said, well, you know, the president, he doesn't like any heat in the room when he's doing an interview. Quickly, your mind goes back because he was seen sweating, perspiring in his debate with John Kennedy. At any rate, so they lowered the temperature to 35 degrees where he was going to do the interview. So as when the television lights went on, the room would be very cool for most of the interview. Well, that speaks, you know, Richard Nixon, amazingly to me, was unsure of himself and how and why he ever got into politics and managed to be so successful in politics. Let's remember that he was elected to congressman, a senator, vice president, and then president 2 times, is one of the great stories of the American presidency.
So interesting. We were talking about danger a little bit. You've been in, gosh, every hot spot in the world. You covered the civil rights movement and saw some very difficult things. Do you have a similar memory of being the most afraid or the most worried for your safety or just for the safety of people around you? Does one stick out in your mind? There have been so many incidents.
Well, I appreciate your asking, and I'm going to try to answer the question, but I do want to emphasize that, you know, if you aspire to be a world-class reporter, at some time or another, you're going to be in danger, in probably real danger. But that's not the way it is all the time. That I try to put it in perspective by telling people that in some ways, on some days, danger has been my business, as it is with almost any international correspondent, and these days, domestic correspondent. So with that as a preface, I would say, anytime you're in a combat zone in war, Vietnam was a dangerous place. Vietnam was a green jungle hell, far worse for people who had to fight the war. But if you were a correspondent in Vietnam, you knew that you were frequently in lethal danger. I would say, you know, so it's hard to say, well, this was more dangerous than that, whatever. But when just after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in late 1979, early 1980, a 60 Minutes crew, including myself, we were the first Western crew to go into Afghanistan. We walked into Afghanistan and we walked out alive 17, 18 days later, I think it was. We had been told before we went in that there was no way we could get in. And if by some chance we did get in, there was no way we would come out alive. And the whole time we were in, I don't want to be overly dramatic about it, we knew we were walking moment to moment on the razor's edge of lethal danger. And indeed, there were a number of times when I did not think we would make it out. And was I afraid? Of course I was afraid. Did I say a lot of times go through the Our Father who art in heaven? You bet.
Wow. And you've also interviewed so many extraordinary people over the course of your career. Is there an interview, any that you wish you could go back and redo?
Oh, I always think I can do it better. I always think I can do it better. Even interviews that wound up, you know, being deemed, quote, successful, I always think I can do better. The interview I did with George H.W. Bush, George Bush I, while he was vice president, when he was running for president, was a live interview that we did within the context of the evening news. And depending on one's point of view, and yes, probably one's political point of view, it either was a terrifically good interview or a lousy interview. If I had to do over, I wouldn't have done that interview live. It would have been better if we did it on tape. Well, because in a live interview, the advantages with the interview subject, which I don't mind that being the case, but it turned contentious. And instead of being able to say, let's pause for a minute here,
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Vice President, and let's just lower the temperature down a bit. And if you will, maybe we need to start over. I don't mean from the first, but with a different tone. When live television, you can't do that. So it was a mistake on our part to have done it live. I certainly didn't do it perfectly. He didn't do it perfectly. And without, let me just make one point, because there's been a lot of controversy about that interview. So as controversial as it was, I didn't start out to do a controversial interview. But the main point of contention is he had been involved in something called the Iran-Contra scandal of the mid-1980s, and he didn't want to admit it. And in that interview, and I used the word lie because he told a lie in the interview, and he sought to divert attention away from that. He later acknowledged in the early 1990s that he had done that during the interview. But long-winded answer, I fear, I could have and should have done that interview better.
Interesting. We're going to go to audience questions pretty soon. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 quick ones. I hope I can do this. You talk about dissent in the book, and you talk about how it's most controversial during a wartime. You mentioned Edward Snowden, what I would argue with, quite a bit of ambivalence. Is there one thing you think of that's dissent right now that you think in retrospect it's unpopular now, but in 10 years it won't be considered so crazy at all?
Gee, I don't know. When we talk about the future, I'm fond of saying, because it's true, that I'm not any good at guessing 10 years from now. That what I've learned is he who lives with a crystal ball learns to eat a lot of broken glass, and I have eaten more than my share. But I will say that I think some of the expressions of dissent, particularly those that we saw this last summer, let's say it would have been last summer, that the most recent ones, there will be at least a footnote in history, I think. I could be wrong about this, because I do believe that as a result of those street demonstrations, now I'm talking about the non-violent,
the Black Lives Matter protests and so forth.
The non-violent protests against racism. I do think it's a hope as much as anything, but I think such things as some legislation to reform police tactics, that sort of thing may result from them. Mm-hmm. I recognize there are plenty of people who say, listen, about this, Dan, you're wrong. They're already in the dustbin of history. My guess is that, a lot will happen in 10 years, but they will at least be noted. For among other things, I do think that they change to some degree the narrative of this presidential race.
Fascinating. We're going to go to questions in 2 minutes. I see that the audience has a ton of questions. We probably won't get to them all, but let me just ask you real quickly. We started off talking about your birthday and your fabulous career and the fact that you are still working. What would you say is your number one tip that you would give people for aging well?
What a good question. Well, if we set aside being lucky and God's grace, set those off in a special category, and the whole business of whatever hereditary traits, I think a determination to spend at least part of your life, a dedication to doing something that's bigger than yourself. Be part of something that's bigger than yourself, and helping, and an attitude of helping other people. But I'm not sure about any of that. I can just say for myself that I'm grateful every day that I've managed to, live this long and with reasonably good health. I do think it helps to have a companion in life that you can stick with through thick and thin. For some people, that's a traditional marriage. For some people, some other kind of relationship, but some relationship in which you have a person who rides through life's sunshine and showers together.
Well, that's a beautiful answer. I probably would have said good moisturizer. So thank you for that.
Or drink a lot.
That too. So I'm going to go ahead and go to these questions. There's a lot, and the audience has kind of upvoted them and picked the ones they most want to hear. So I'm going to respect that and go ahead and ask them in that order, Dan. Connie says, on the topic of truth, so many people seem now to reject the notion of objective truth. We hear people talking about their own truths, seemingly embracing that they're equally valid, yet competing realms of truth that we are at liberty to accept or reject. Can we ever get reunited around a shared belief that there are truths that can be established even when they don't square with our own opinions and interests?
Your question is, can we? And the answer is yes, we can. Remember, I'm an optimist by experience and by nature. I always think we can do it. But the answer to your question is, can we? Beyond that is the second question, will we? That's part of what we're in the process of deciding just now, not only with our election or re-election of a president, but what we decide to do. Because as you point out correctly, this has been brought into question. Is there any such thing as objective truth? You know, my own argument, of course there is. 2 and 2 equals 4. It does not equal 5. Water does not run uphill. These are factual things. But there has to be a general agreement on certain objective truths. Your question is, can we get back to a point where there are enough people who believe that to keep the country on an even keel? I think so, but it's up to question now, will we do that, or will we continue to descend into this argument over there is no objective truth, there are alternative facts, and etc.
From Christina, she says, my niece is just becoming an adult in Appalachia. While she is genuinely kind, caring human, she is surrounded by highly divisive political ideologies and really hateful rhetoric. What advice would you give to our young adults about how to keep their empathy and their kindness in such divisive times? And how can she communicate that with the older generation and connect with them and still get the respect she deserves as a thoughtful human with very real values and beliefs? Because I don't just want to tell her to grit her teeth and smile her way through these disagreements, but to be strong. How would you address that?
What a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I think it begins, and I wish this young person all the good luck in the world. I think it begins with keep smiling, keep being kind, keep trying, and be strong and be persistent.
This is an interesting one. Have you ever considered or even flirted with the idea of running for election yourself?
No.
And
never,
why not? Don wants to know.
For a second. When I first got into television and was anchoring the news in Houston on a local television station, there were some people who approached me about possibly running for Congress in Houston, and I immediately dismissed it. The reason is that for whatever reason, I have dreamed of being a reporter ever since I can remember anything. When I was 5 and 6 years old, when everybody said, you know, I want to be an airplane pilot, I want to be an Indian chief, I always said I wanted to be a reporter. I was saying I wanted to be a reporter before I really knew what a reporter was. That my driving dream has always been to be a journalist. And I've never wavered from that, in that I've been lucky. But because of that, I happen to think I'd make a very poor politician. There are plenty of people who want to argue that I've been a pretty poor journalist as well, but set that aside for the moment. That is just that I've been attached professionally to this dream of being a reporter. And yes, you know, my aspiration, the driving polar star, has been to try to be a great reporter. I'm not that, I haven't been that, but I'm still trying to do that. And because of that, it never really entered my mind at all to even consider running for public office. I have great admiration for people who do run for public office.
Shannon asks, you have a very close relationship with your grandson, Martin. Being of different generations, has he helped inform your ideas or changed your ideas about youth today in politics? And is the engagement of young people in politics different than when you were growing up?
Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. I have two grandsons. Martin, my oldest grandson, is 23, going on 24, I believe it is now. And my other grandson, Andy, is 19. I'm happy to say I have a very close relationship with both of them, and I'm very grateful for that. There's a good deal of difference that my father and mother, neither of whom had finished high school, which was not unusual in their place and time, but were very interested in politics. And they talked politics with me and my brother and sister almost from the time we were able to talk, if you will. With Martin and Andy, with my grandsons, what strikes me is that they are much smarter at a younger age, or let me say, much better educated at younger ages than I ever was. And as a consequence of that, I can talk politics with them, and so can my wife, Jean, at a level that I think is far above what my parents were able to talk to me at comparable ages.
Do you think the traditional network nightly newscast will still exist in 5 or 10 years?
You know, I don't know. And again, I'm going to say that I'm not good about predicting. But as much as I hope they will, I have my doubts. 5 or 10 years is a long time. In journalism, as in politics, overnight's a long time. A month or a week is forever, and we're talking about 5 or 6 years. But because the methods of communication are evolving so quickly and have been the acceleration of the pace of change in how we communicate. I mean, right now the internet dominates. Who knows what new inventions are out there? It's, as much as I hope I'm wrong about it, it's hard for me to see how the early evening newscasts, as they're now constructed, and the place and the manner they've been for well over 50 or 75 years, it's hard for me to see how they survive.
Someone says, thanks for writing about unity in this country. It's hard to see the country coming back together. What is your take on stories speculating on possible violent conflict after the election?
Well, I'm sorry to say, I think we have to be prepared for that possibility, but we also have to caution ourselves against having the expectation lead to something really happening. On the one hand, we have to be prepared, because in the end, when the final votes are counted, who knows how long it will take, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And as passionate as so many people have been on the divides of this particular election, I'd have to say the potential is certainly there for violence. The best we can do is say to ourselves, whatever happens, we need to hold steady. There's a whole chapter in What Unites Us about steady. It was one of my father's favorite words. But going into the final vote day, I hope our attitude in general for the country as a whole will be, it's a time of turbulence. We need to have hope. We need to have patience. We need to hold steady. If there's violence, we have to be determined to handle it, but hold steady through it and not get caught up in it.
Dan, do you think the mainstream media, as this questioner put it, has been as tough on Biden as they have been on Trump?
Well, I'm pausing because it's a very good question, but it depends on the context of it. I don't want to dodge the question, I'll get to it. That in some ways they've been tougher on Biden than they've been on Trump. But overall, in the main, I think it's evened out. I think there have been some very tough questions asked of Trump, but there have been some very tough questions asked of Biden. References my old friends at 60 Minutes. The question of Joe Biden was, if anything, tougher than it was the questioning on Donald Trump, partly because Trump walked out. But the answer to your question is, I think it's pretty much evened out.
And speaking of Joe Biden, Ann asks, what will be Joe Biden's challenges if he is elected president? There's a lot there.
Oh boy, there are a lot. I think his number one challenge is to seek to try to pull the country together, to emphasize those things that unite us, and have a reconciliation. Reconciliation is job one for Joe Biden. He has a lot of things facing him, but nothing bigger than that. And whether he is able to or not, speak to people who voted for Trump and convince them that he wants to be president of them as well as the people who voted for him. That one great difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I'm sorry to say, has not even tried to be president of all the people in the United States. He's basically tried to be president for those who support him, for call his base. Joe Biden's challenge is to convince people that he's a new president, if he wins, that he's not only a new president, but a new kind of president, and will seek reconciliation with what is now known as Trump base. I know there are people listening to this who will say, I don't think that's possible. Joe Biden has to believe it's possible, and he has to make it possible.
If the audience will forgive me, I'm just curious. I would love to follow up on that and say, do you think that you would have been that candid about your views of a president when you were on the desk at night? Would you have been able to say that, for example, about Richard Nixon? Or are you in a different era now?
No. That I'm at a different stage of my life and my career now. That I spent most of my career trying to be an honest broker of information, a gatherer of facts, what some people call a straight news reporter. Again, other people have to judge how well or how poorly I did that, but that's what I try to do. Now, let's face it, I'm on the backside of the mountain. That I frequently now, I have another trip on my mind, the trip into eternity. And I'm no longer a hell for leather, answer the sound of gunfire around the world international reporter. And I'm no longer trying to be America's anchorman. What I'm trying to do now is I do commentary, not editorialism. Difference between editorial and commentary. Editorial suggests a course of action. You should vote why. Commentary is to say, folks, I've been a few places, I've seen a few things. I'd like to take what's happening today and put it in some historical and cultural context for you. That's what I'm trying to do now. And that's a good deal different from what I spent most of my career trying to do.
Here's a question the audience upvoted and wanted to make sure I asked. Mr. Rather, have you ever seen this country as divided as it is now? If not, what do you think has been the major catapulting factor in the comparison to the tumultuous 1960s?
Well, first of all, the country has been at least as divided as it is now. Let us not forget, and I don't mean to downplay our divisions at all, but we fought a great civil war in which we killed almost 700,000 of our own people in the Civil War. What we're going through now is as bad as it is in terms of division. It's not that bad. And we survived that and got through the other way. The 1960s, it's easy to forget. We were very much divided to much of the 60s, divided on race, divided about the war, divided on generational differences. So I do think we need to keep that in mind, that there's a tendency to think, God, this is the worst that it's ever been by far. Some aspects of it are unique and to this particular time, but this is not the worst we've been through, but it's bad enough, if you will. The difference between the 1960s and today, we could spend the rest of the night speaking about it. You'll be relieved to know we won't. But among the big differences that I see, that many of the demonstrations, and let's remember, they were actual race riots in the 1960s, with portions of cities burning as a result. But the biggest difference I can see is the diversity of people who are engaging in nonviolent protest today. That it's a mix, ethnically, racially, religiously. In the 1960s, the anti-war demonstrations tended to be young people. On the racial front, the protests tended to be strongly African Americans, people of African American heritage. What we've seen, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, is a much richer demographic mix. That's a big difference between now and the 1960s.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. Mark wants to know your opinion. Should Fox News be considered journalism? Why or why not?
Well, Fox News in the evening, as say in prime time, is this is my opinion, clearly labeled, is as close as we ever had to an actual government propaganda outlet. Now that's in their prime time lineup, beginning roughly, 7 o'clock in the evening, maybe 8. In other parts of the day, Fox can be seen as a definitely far right, politically oriented news organization, but it is a news gathering organization. It is not an international world news gathering organization. Fox doesn't have much, if any, of an international news gathering capacity. But in answer to the question that I've said it, that they have what can be considered a journalistic arm, and then at night it turns into a straight up propaganda operation, and an operational arm of the Trump White House, I'm sorry to say. I know that's strong language, but I think their record merits that.
Terry wants to know if you could give a piece of advice to President Trump, what would that advice be?
Don't be afraid. I think much of the unattractive side of Donald Trump is because he has down deep, he's afraid. I think the number one question I always want to know, Mr. President, of what are you afraid? Why are you so afraid? That he must have these inner fears. I'm not a psychologist, but you just take a look at the record, listen to what he says, and watch what he does. And I think that's the key question with him.
So patriotism, in the book you talk about it. Can you kind of define what patriotism means to you? Weston asks.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because I try to deal with this in the early stages of the book. That patriotism is one thing. Nationalism, especially extreme nationalism, is another thing. And there's frequently an effort to confuse the two. But patriotism is a deep and abiding love of your country, a love so deep that literally you're prepared, if necessary, to give up your life for your country, but a recognition that your country is not perfect and that you want to be part of making your country ever better and improving. There's a certain humility with patriotism, which is to recognize that no country is perfect. Whatever your country is, our country is a great country, but it is not perfect. That's the essence of patriotism. A certain humility is the essence of patriotism, with still a deep-seated passion to want your country to succeed and be willing to help it. Nationalism is more akin to arrogance. There's a certain arrogance with nationalism, and particularly extreme nationalism is, my country is the best at everything. My country is perfect. No other country can even come close to it, so forth and so on. And we know what happens when nationalism is taken to an extreme. You quickly come into autocracy, and autocracy leads you into tribalism. And we know that if we ever go down completely down that slope, let extreme nationalism carry us into a strictly autocratic leadership, and the country descends into tribalism, then we're finished as the America we know. Now, I don't think we're close to that, but that is the inherent danger. Your question was the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And I've said, I think patriotism at base has a humility to it. Nationalism has a certain arrogance to it.
Okay, I'm going to let Nyla have the last word. This is your last question. If I didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. And some of these, they're great questions. They just would take more time than we have to answer. So I'm going to let Nyla ask the last one. Dan, how does it feel to be a national treasure? You've brought so much comfort, humor, and wisdom into our lives.
I really appreciate both the spirit and substance of that question. But, I can be dumb as that brick wall behind you about a lot of things, but at least I'm smart enough to know who I am, what I am, and what I am not. I'm not a national treasure. Basically what you got here, folks, is I'm a reporter who got lucky, very, very lucky. And I'm grateful every day that it happened to me. But I have no illusions. But I am grateful for the question. I'm grateful for the thought behind the question. And, you know, I do the best I can while knowing that I can't do it perfectly and never have.
Well, Jennifer, great moderating, and Dan, treasure or not, it really is wonderful being able to continue getting your seasoned perspective, your commentary on so much that's going on today. And a special thanks to, on behalf of independent bookstores, for the support that you've shown us. Twice in recent days, you've tweeted to your more than 1.5 million followers an encouraging shop indie message, which is much appreciated during this challenging economic time for local bookstores and for many other neighborhood businesses. To everyone watching, a reminder that you can find a link in the chat column to purchase Dan's book, What Unites Us. And if you haven't already, I'd urge you also to get Jennifer's excellent book, The Firsts. And there's also a link in the chat column to her book. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you, Jennifer.